Hi everyone, welcome to the Brown History Podcast. My name is Essen and this is episode 33. Back in the day, before podcasts and TV and film, even before novels came about, stories were pretty much told orally. Storytelling in South Asia wasn't just a job people had back in the day to make some money to pay the bills. It was an actual art form that was appreciated and respected, and it was a craft that required skill and practice. It was not easy at all. And this is what this episode is going to be about. It's going to be about storytellers of South Asia. We're going to discuss not just the stories that were told back then, but also about the storytellers themselves and how colonialism affected them. Our guest today is Pasha M. Khan. He has a book out on this subject and it's called The Broken Spell, Indian Storytelling and the Romance Genre in Persian and Urdu. It's an awesome book and it's going to be an awesome episode. So before we start, I just got to say that the Brown History Instagram feed, the podcast, and the newsletter are all handled by one person, and that's me. And honestly, it can get pretty rough and exhausting. And if you'd like to help out, consider being a patron, or you can just do a one-time donation. Just visit www.brownhistorypodcast.com. Thank you for listening, and let's begin.
Yeah. No, I'm coming into this cold, so I don't know. Like I'm not really prepped for this. I'm just so busy that I don't have any time to prepare for these things. But luckily, I'm teaching a course on Urdu poetry right now. So
yeah, tell us more about that. I guess that's a good introduction for people who don't know who you are.
So to introduce myself. My name is Mohammed Pasha. I'm a professor at the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill University, and I'm the chair in Urdu language and culture. I'm furniture. And the Urdu poetry course that I'm teaching this year begins with the most recent poets and goes backwards to Mir Taqi Mir. Right now I'm teaching it over Zoom, and I have something like 300 to 400 auditors in it. So clearly people are interested in Urdu poetry. And what's interesting is that so many of them, I would say something like at least half of them are from India. And, like given what we hear about India these days, the kind of marginalization of the Urdu language that's going on over there, and the kind of attempt to link Urdu to a Muslim identity and to marginalize it on that basis that this is a Muslim language. So many of my students are non-Muslims from India, for example, and they're really interested in learning this stuff. So I'm really glad that it got the response that it got, and we're having fun.
That is amazing. I would love to do an episode on that subject, but right now the focus of the subject is storytellers. I know you have a book out on storytellers of that era.
Sure.
So when you say storytellers, I imagine the stereotype storyteller where he comes into a street of a village or a town and he gathers a crowd, and there's a crowd that circles around him with kids sitting down, and he tells this great story and everybody is just kind of awed and listening in, and then he collects change in the end for his for his payment of what he provided for the crowd, which was entertainment. And I guess that's my very naive view of it. I want you to tell me what is the proper view of what a storyteller, and I'm using the wrong word, the English word version of it, storyteller.
Okay.
But could you tell us the proper words and the proper term for it, and what is it really viewed as?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about qissa khans, which is the Urdu / Persian term for storyteller, I mean you're not necessarily wrong, because of course there are these popular storytellers who operate at the street level or in the bazaar. There are mentions of, for example, storytellers in Delhi reciting on the steps of the Jama Masjid in Delhi. But the way that history works, given that that very often the history that comes down to us, especially from South Asia, is focused on the elite, most of the information that we have is about elite storytellers. So, in other words, storytellers like Darbar Khan, who was the storyteller to the Emperor Akbar, storytellers who were operating in sub-imperial courts, and they were mainly telling two stories. They were telling the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, Shahnama, or they were telling the Qissai Amir Hamza, the adventures of Hamza, as it's been translated, for example, recently by Musharraf Ali Faruqi. These were the two qissas that were, or long stories,
Kissa,
dastans.
Kissa is story and Dastan is long story.
Basically, so this is the idea that a lot of people have operated with, that qissa is a short story and dastan is a long story. But actually, if we look at qissas, when we read them, qissas are often cut up into shorter dastans, so it's not that simple a division. But basically, these stories were, for example, the story of Amir Hamza was a tale of a hero, Amir Hamza, who was the uncle of the prophet, right? And this makes things dicey in some cases for people who don't want the prophet's family to be depicted in a certain way. He goes off on a series of quests. He winds up trapped in what's called a tilism, which is an enchanted world, which is produced by sorcerers. What they do is they have magical devices in which they create magic squares, and they harness the power of the stars to produce magical worlds on the earth. And some of those worlds are very strange. Like there's a tilism in which everything is made of shit, and there's a tilism in which there are giant man-eating ducks, and there's a tilism in which his enemies are soldiers made of paper, for example. And what he has to do is to fight his way out of the tilism, this enchanted world. So this is the kind of tale that would be told. This is the level of marvelousness, of fantasticness that would be put forward by these storytellers. And you can imagine that whoever was listening to them was enthralled by them. And of course, they would use certain techniques as well to keep their audiences engaged. So in English, we have the idea of a cliffhanger. They have that concept as well, where they would leave the story. They would break the story at a particularly suspenseful point, right? In some cases, they would, for example, they would stretch it out. So, for example, everyone wants to know about. Everyone wants to get to the point where the hero and his beloved get together, right? They finally unite. And in some cases, what the storyteller would do, so for example, the 19th, 20th century storyteller Mir Bakr Ali, who died in 1928 and who's referred to as the last storyteller of Urdu, what he would do, he says, and others say, is to, when he got to this point in which the lover is about to unite with his beloved, he would describe it very slowly, so that basically the process of getting into the door would take an entire day. And then maybe the next day as well, they would describe like the next step being taken. And according to one of the accounts, one of his patrons got really pissed, and he said, enough already, just do it. But for example, they might ask for more money to speed it up. So obviously, storytelling was a transaction, right?
Yeah.
And storytellers would play to their audiences in terms of what they thought their audiences wanted, in terms of the amount of time they had, in terms of keeping their audiences coming back, and in terms of what their audiences were willing to pay to see, right? So, for example, if an emperor wanted an evil character to be not to be killed, some emperors were grew very attached to enemy characters, which is weird, but or maybe not so weird, given that emperors are not necessarily cute
Normal.
and cuddly guys. Um, so they would pay the storyteller to make sure that the enemy character was not killed, right? So
Mhm.
this is not just like something that the storyteller is reading off of a page of paper, right? It's not totally scripted by any means. It's something that there is some kind of script, but the storyteller is weaving it in the process of telling it according to his circumstances.
Is there like a general theme to the stories being told, lessons, or maybe I don't know if you know of Joseph Campbell, where the hero kind of learns a lesson in the end. Do
Right.
they have a certain theme, or and also is there I know you have your Persian storytellers and you have your Urdu storytellers. Is there a difference between them? Do they kind of interlink with each other, or do they have like East Coast, West Coast rap tension between each other?
um, so differences between Persian and Urdu storytellers, there isn't very much at all. The Urdu storytelling tradition, at least the elite tradition, is very much a continuation of the Persian storytelling tradition. But there are tales that are told mainly in the subcontinent, in Hindustan, or what we call India. Um, and there are tales that are told mainly in Iran. So especially after maybe the 16th century, the Shahnama, the Book of Kings, became kind of institutionalized as the story to tell in Iran, whereas in India they were more often telling the story of Amir Hamza, and that had to do with an idea that the Book of Kings, the Shahnama, was a book about Iran and Iranian dynasties, whereas in the Qissa Mir Hamza, Iran doesn't look so great. The main Iranian emperor in this tale, Noshirwan, is the father of Amir Hamza's beloved, and he's misled by his viziers, his prime ministers, in into opposing Hamza, into opposing the hero of this story. So there's definitely a kind of, on the basis of dynastic identity, there is a difference there between the two, but also in terms of regional or local stories. I mean, I haven't spoken so far about stories aside from the Shahnam or the Tale of Amin Hamza. There were local South Asian stories, of course, and there continue to be, like the Pisai Hatim Tai, the story of Hatim Tai, or stories of the stories told by the parrot and the myna bird, for example. That were local to India and that weren't normally told in Iran, and that were set in an Indian setting, for example. And of course, aside from Urdu and Persian, there was storytelling in other languages as well. For example, in Punjabi, that was totally different in some cases from the Urdu and Persian stories.
What were the value of storytellers in society? Did they make good money, or were they seen as just people who entertain, or was there kind of a snobby, serious kind of art form look to it?
Yeah. So so right now, or I should say, in the 20th century, because the novel, like, these days, when my students submit essays, sometimes they refer to, like, everything that they read as a novel, right? And that shows, no, I don't know why they do that, but it shows how important the novel has become in our society, right? When we read something, we're often reading a novel. What people want to put on their reading lists are novels. And the novel in South Asia only becomes important by the end of the 19th century, so around 120 years ago or so.
Mm.
Um, and the novel at that time, like today, we have all kinds of crazy things happening in novels, and we have different genres of novels, sci-fi, fantasy, and whatever, which come closer to the world that the Qissa depicted. But especially for the British back then, the novel was something that had to be realistic. It had to show events and characters that operated according to reason. The British were on a reason kick at that time,
Wow.
and they really wanted to put South Asians to fit South Asians into that same mold, and they succeeded to a great degree. And one of the problems with that, one of the losses, I should say, that produced, was that South Asians began to see these fantastic tales as childish, right? Because the British associated them with children, and they associated the quote unquote Oriental mind with childishness, right? That they really like these stories. They must believe them, and therefore they're like children. They don't have the kind of mental capacity that British adults have to appreciate novels that are actually depicting things that happen in the world. So by the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century especially, these qissas are devalued in this way because they contain dragons and giant man-eating ducks.
Wow. Before the British came, before colonialism, came in, what was the value of storytellers within the society of South Asia?
Right, and that's a good question. So even before the British came, there was a debate, of course, over whether qissas were valuable, and definitely the most important genre of verbal art or literature was the ghazal. Poetry was very important, and qissas that were recited were very often in prose rather than poetry, but nevertheless they were highly valued, and the reasons are many. Storytellers put forward the argument that what qissas did was to, first of all, improve your language, that they were presented in an exemplary language, a language that people could learn from and improve their own linguistic skills by, and also that they presented lessons for rulers, especially, on how to wage battle, on how to conduct warfare, and on how to deal with the enemy, right? So that was a point that was stressed by many storytellers, and then more generally, the idea that the hero of these stories was someone whose ethics, whose morals could be emulated, was something that was put forward by storytellers, and sometimes by the stories themselves. But of course, one of the kind of tricky things with regard to the heroes is that the Dastango Amir Hamza, the Qissa Amir Hamza, or the Adventures of Amir Hamza, is about the uncle of the Prophet,
Yeah.
There's another story, the Khawaran Nama, which was popular in Iran, but we also have copies in South Asia. That was about the adventures of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet, for example. There are all these Shi'i-leaning tales that involve these characters. And I went to the British Library some years ago, and I looked at a copy of the Khawaran Nama, which is, by the way, never been edited and published. It's just a manuscript copy.
Hmm.
And there are images of Ali and his crew hanging
Whoa.
out with giant 7 foot purple jinns and this kind of stuff. So you can imagine that some people would be wary of this, and Qissa Khans would say at the beginning of their stories, this is just something I heard, right? This is
Yeah.
not. I'm not responsible for the truth or the falsehood of this, right? So they didn't present it as something that was necessarily true often, but they also didn't say that it was not true. So they kind of hedged their bets in that way.
Okay. Um, how did storytellers improve on their craft? Because I understand from reading your book that they made manuals on how to be a good storyteller and what storytellers should do.
Absolutely. Yeah. So these manuals, and I'm indebted to my colleague, Professor Usman Hamid, for giving me access to a copy of this. We know of at least one manual for storytellers called the Tirazul Akhbar, which was created in the 17th century in India, in Patna, by an Iranian storyteller who had emigrated to India. His name was Abdul Nabi Fakhruzamani. He was from Qazvin in Iran. There's actually another one that used to be in Lahore, but when I went to the Punjab University Library to try to find it, the librarian told me that the person it had belonged to, after he passed away, his son was a heroin addict, and so he just sold all of his father's manuscripts
Wow.
to pay for his drug habit. So that manuscript, we have no idea where it is. It's just been sold by this druggie to, I don't know, the garbage collector. So anyways, but the Taraz Akhbar itself, this one manual for storytellers that remains, contains an introduction in which the storyteller tells us how exactly to perform, what kinds of techniques storytellers should use. What it shows, one of the things that it shows, is that storytellers, even in India, are performing in coffee houses. So this is something that's very much associated with Iran and with the Ottoman Empire. And coffee doesn't come back to at least North India until the 20th century. So when I was growing up, if we went back to Pakistan, it was impossible to get coffee. We only had tea. But back then, coffee was being served in India, especially in places where travelers would come from Iran. So there was a lot of coffee house performances for people who were traveling into the country. What the manual was, the majority of it, was a series of quotations from other sources. So what storytellers would do basically is that they would memorize a lot. And I don't have that kind of memorization capacity. It seems like nobody in our age does, because of the internet and everything being, when
Mhm.
we want to remember something, we just look at
Yeah,
our phones.
100%.
So, but storytellers would memorize these snippets of poetry and prose from pre-existing sources, and they would weave them together into their narrative. So, for example, if they wanted to quote something that was, if for example they were describing a battle, and they wanted to describe the elephant, the war elephant that was being put forward by the enemy, they might think, oh, I know this piece of poetry about a war elephant that I read in this manual for storytellers, for example, and they would recite it, and they would make the story more luscious by this means. And of course, people loved the interpolation of poetry into prose, just as some of them do right now.
It sounds like these storytellers are very, very intelligent people. If they're using, fancy language, if they're teaching emperors war lessons, then they must be really, educated or self-educated people.
Absolutely. So, for example, Fakhr Zamani came from a long line of Sufis. Darbar Khan was the son of a storyteller who told his stories at the Iranian court. Darbar Khan was Akbar's, the Mughal emperor's storyteller, and he was the son of a storyteller in the imperial employ in Iran. And Darbar Khan he wasn't just a storyteller, he was also like a diplomat, and he was working for Akbar in a kind of reconnaissance capacity as well. So clearly these were well educated people in many cases. But we also have storytellers, for example, working in Punjabi, like let's see, Kamaluddin in the 20th century, who were basically, we would call them, even though they were Muslim, we would call them lower caste. They're the Mirasis, and
they're the musicians.
Yeah, they're often musicians, and what their mental capacity is not necessarily due to any kind of formal education. It's due to the way in which their elders have educated them, right, in the tradition. So it's more about that rather than about going to. I advocate for university learning, but or going to college or whatever. But of course these Mirasis were trained by their elders or by teachers in their tradition rather than formally.
So storytelling was a great art form once upon a time, and then the British come in and they bring the novel, and now all of a sudden this industry that was blooming and on top is slowly dying out. What happens to the storytellers? How do they survive? Do they, I guess, change jobs, or do they try different ways to win back the audience?
So one of the things that happens, aside from the novel, is that storytellers get supplanted by films. So you can imagine what storytelling is like. My friend Danish Hussain, who's also a Bollywood actor, is also a modern storyteller, for example. And the way that he tells stories is very much inspired by the way in which these qissa khans or dastangos told stories. And you can imagine that it's not just sitting there with a book and reading off the page. They're making gestures, they're raising themselves, they're modulating their voice, they're changing the way that they recite according to the situation. And so it's theatrical, right? It's dramatic. It's like a dramatic performance on stage. And so when films became accessible to people, that became a kind of a point of rivalry for these storytellers. But and it supplanted their craft to a great deal. But also, these films, especially earlier Bollywood films, would often use the same qissas, the same stories that these storytellers would be telling. Especially popular stories like Ali Baba and whatnot. Yes, yeah.
Sorry, someone is hitting a door. A cat is tapping a door.
It's my cat. Yeah, sorry.
That's all right.
You heard the meows as well. Probably.
Yeah, I did, but that's okay.
Okay. So Rasgullah Billah, he's the king of my house. Yeah. So
Carry on.
So what I was saying about you were asking about film and
what were they doing to survive? What were they doing?
What they were doing to survive?
What was happening to them now? Because they were out of jobs, I guess. So they were out of money. They must be struggling to survive.
Absolutely. And in the 20th century, what we see is that it's not only because of lack of interest in the qissa, it's also because their traditional means of patronage are dying. So for example, the Mughal emperor is not there anymore after 1850. After 1857, the Mughal dynasty is finished. Local rulers are slowly dropping off. These princely states are being finished by Nehru's government, or in Pakistan. And so they're losing their traditional modes of patronage, at least the elite storytellers. And so Mir Bakir Ali Dastango, the last storyteller of Delhi, who passed away in 1928, is really the last major Urdu storyteller that we know in the 20th century. As far as we know, in Urdu, this profession of storytelling that he embodied seems to have just finished. There is no survival as such. What there is by the 21st century is a revival. So what happens is that the scholar Shamsur Rahman Farooqi, who passed away recently and who lived in Allahabad, India, wrote a series of books on the qissa in Urdu. It's called Sahari Shahi Sahib Kirani. And through his scholarship, storytellers begin to pick up the old traditions and to tell them on the stage. So storytellers like Danish Hussain, Fawzia Dastango, for example. So this tradition only really begins to be picked up again in Urdu by the 21st century. There are other local traditions happening. So, for example, in Bengal or in Punjab, on the very kind of low caste, for example, scale, these traditions are still going on. But at the kind of middle class and elite level, these traditions are only picked up again by the 21st century. And unfortunately, even in the 20th century and 21st century, these other local, especially rural traditions, we don't have very much record of them, because people who were gathering documents to produce history just weren't paying attention to the Punjabi or the Bengali storytellers. So the answer is that, for the Urdu storytellers at least, there was no survival, there was a revival in the 21st century.
Okay, and you kind of mentioned this a bit, but how did film come into play with qissas? That must have been a great second chance for these stories to kind of move forward and be preserved.
Yeah, it's amazing. I wish I could show some of the stories that have been made into
well, give me some examples. Maybe there are people.
Well, for example, there's the series of Hatimtai films, the stories of Hatimtai. These are like, so especially by our kind of snobbish standards, these are often considered B-grade films, or for example, Pakistani films that contain these crazy like
Stunts.
horror-like elements, yeah, are are not considered highbrow. But for example, in the Qisai Hatim Tai, one of the scenes that I remember is that Hatim Tai and his sidekick Nazru are sitting beneath a tree having a picnic, and suddenly the trees come to life. This is like a 1992 film. The trees come to life, and they're like ants in Lord of the Rings, for example, and they're walking around with with their branches as claws, and they're shooting red light out of their eyes. They have eyes with red light, so it's like a weird horror film,
Mm-hmm.
and it looks really campy, it looks really cheesy, but it's also really fascinating, for example. Or there's another scene in that film in which Hatim fights a leopard who jumps out at him from a tree, and the left like it's obviously a stuffed leopard, first of all, and his he kills it, and his knife, it looks like it has ketchup on it. It's really it's really they're really kind of cheap effects, and really but also really fun and fantastical, and they really embody the kind of crazy things that happen in the Qissa tradition. So Hatim Tai, the stories of Sikandar, Alexander the Great, the stories of Ali Baba or Chalis Chor, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves,
Right.
is there. And as the century progresses, as the 20th century progresses, these stories are still there into the 90s, and they still are there. It's just that very often they're getting made into TV serials nowadays rather than films.
I'm curious. During Muharram in the majlises, it's the Molana goes up and he tells this whole story, and the audience cries, and there's a really big emotion. He's really kind of exploiting
Absolutely.
the audience's emotions and their love for Imam Hussein and etc. Is that tied to story
Absolutely.
form telling in Iran and in South Asia?
Absolutely. So very often the storytellers were Shiites. They were very often Shia.
Yeah.
And
Storytellers were often Shia back then.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah.
That's insane.
Yeah. So, for example, Fakhr Zamani would have been a Shia, and the practice, the Shia practice of Marsiya Khani, the practice of telling long narrative stories in poetry about Karbala, about the killing of Hussein and the family of the Prophet. That was also performed in this kind of dramatic way, especially in the 19th century, and so they would kind of use the power of their voices to have this emotional effect on their audiences, and they would probably move in the same way as storytellers. And we know that storytellers and Marsiya Khans, the reciters of these poems in remembrance of the family of the Prophet, were watching each other's performances. And in some cases, they were one and the same person. In some cases, these storytellers were also reciting poetry or prose in commemoration of Hussein and his family, and so there's totally a connection between the two. The two traditions are affecting each other very, very closely.
That's interesting. That's really cool.
Yeah.
If people would want to know more about Kissas and they want to read more stories instead of watching the TV shows, you said, which books you think they should go back and see? Because there's a lot of books written not on it, but of it. with the art, with the Mughal arts, and there's beautiful pictures that go with the writing. So is there any, I'm sure they're all online. You can like find them on archives and things like that, I think. Is there any books you recommend for someone to just get a good introduction to it?
Sure, self-promo time. So first of all, my own book, The Broken Spell by Mohammed Pasha, published in 2019 by Wayne State University Press,
Very good
is
book.
uh, is a good introduction to the qissa form. But also, they should read The Adventures of Amir Hamza by Musharraf Ali Faruqi, which is a translation of a short Urdu version, even though it's like huge. It's actually a shorter Urdu version of the tale of Amir Hamza. They should definitely read that. My PhD supervisor, Francis Pritchett, wrote a book about called the Urdu. I believe it's called the Urdu Romance Tradition. I would need to check up on that. But also, you mentioned images, and just to give you some context, what would happen in especially Akbar's court is that there would be storytellers who did what they called pardakhani, which was when they held up, or they would have someone hold up an image, and they would tell the story on the basis of what was happening in the image, or with the help of what was happening in the image. And that's something that Orhan Pamuk describes, for example, in his novel My Name Is Red, which involves a lot of storytellers in Turkey. So to see those images, of course, they're online, they're scattered all over the place. But John Saylor and Ebba Koch have a volume called, I believe, the same thing, The Adventures of Amir Hamza, which is unfortunately not available online. But if you can get a copy of it at your library, then you can see those images. You can also, I guess, go to various museum web pages and Google them, but no one has actually put them all together online, which should be easy to do. It's surprising that nobody has done it yet.
I just remembered a question. What is your issue with genre, with the term genre? Because there's something you talk about a lot, and I couldn't really grasp it.
Mhm. When it comes to genre, so basically, what I was asking myself when I undertook this study is, okay, what is the qissa? The qissa is a genre of literature, or a genre of verbal art. So, but first of all, I had to answer what is a genre, right?
Mm-hmm.
Going back to basics. And as I researched the kind of theory on genre, I realized that it's much more fluid and constructed than you imagine. So, for example, what the British novel in the 19th century might have been quite different from what we think of as a novel in the 21st century. So Salman Rushdie's Midnight Children, or something like that, Life of Pi,
Mm-hmm.
might not have been counted by the British as novels. They might have been thought of as romances, because they contain these things that couldn't happen, right? Tigers
Yeah.
and crazy, this idea of magic realism, for example, might not have been taken by the British as
A novel.
real novels. And so the way in which we classify literature into genres has changed over time. And so one of the results of this is that, depending on how you define a piece of literature according to its genre, they also have different values. So, for example, the qissa was valued differently in the 16th century. It was valued more highly than it was in the 19th century. And so this is really most of what I was trying to get at with my my reflections on genre, but also the other thing that I wanted to stress is that sometimes we can see traces of different genres in a text that belongs to another genre. So, for example, um, in in a history, we might see something that reminds us of a qissa, or in a qissa we might see something that reminds us of history. For example, in the qissa of Amir Hamza we know is a historical character.
Right.
My my dad once asked me about him. Oh, are these stories about him true? He's a real historical character. Are these stories true? And then he
Yeah.
answered himself, no, they couldn't be true. They have men eating ducks in them, right? So the there's a certain effect produced by the presence of a historical element in a qissa, right? People are really interested in this because they think, oh, I know about this character. This character lived, and could he have done all of these things? Or why is he the one being talked about? So in other words, genres kind of crisscross into each other, and they kind of infect one another. That's all that I was trying to the point that I was trying to make with that. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but that's for nerds.
I think that's all we have. I had the questions for this. Is there something you want to add in, before we go? Do you want to talk about your next plug-in something?
No, it's okay.
No?
Well,
All right.
Okay, look. I'll tell you about my next project, which is a translation. I'm working on a translation of a qissa. It's called the Qissa Agarogul, and it's about the daughter of the minister of the king of Poppy Seed City, who, because
Poppy Seed City,
yeah, who the prince is kidnapped by a demon who falls in love with him. The demon falls in love with the prince, and he abducts him, and so there's no heir to the throne. So they turn the daughter of the vizier, of the minister, into a new prince, and he lives his life out as a man, as a prince. And eventually the original prince comes back, and Agar, the new prince, who was born as a girl, really does not want to turn back into a girl. So it's a story about this, about how this kind of what we would now call a trans character is depicted in this story, and how eventually he is forced to turn back into a woman.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah. What is Poppy Seed City? That's like a city. It's an actual city.
No, it's not an actual city. They just named the city Poppy Seed City. I don't know why.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna turn it off the recording now.